Time to introduce our first keynote speaker. He's already on screen. It's Mr. Phil Beck, a researcher with extensive experience in all sorts of work fields related to local governments in various settings and backgrounds. And most recently, in the past few years, he's contributed to the Nature Smart Cities project as a research associate on behalf of the London Imperial College. And he has been doing work to identify the challenges that should form the basis for informing local authorities to invest in green infrastructure. So please, Phil, could you tell us more about this work and your findings?
Thank you, Tako. Yes, I'm very happy to do that. I'm going to be looking in this short presentation at the challenges that face smaller local authorities in relation to green infrastructure. But these aren't just my thoughts on this important subject. These are, in fact, the thoughts of people who took part in an extensive research program. And this is the slide that Anna showed you a few moments ago with the four main inputs into the business model development process set out on the left-hand side here. And I'm going to talk about two of those. These two, the interview study that we did looking at smaller cities' approach to green infrastructure and the challenges that face smaller cities in that kind of work, and a review that Nature Smart Cities commissioned of the finance options that might be available for green infrastructure. And both of those studies have been published, and copies of those are available free of charge in the Nature Smart Cities website library section. And I commend them to you. They're an interesting and informative read. So the research was carried out by Imperial College London, one of the academic partners in Nature Smart Cities. I worked for them at that time, and I led the research process. It was published as this booklet, Getting More Green, the key findings of a review of smaller cities' approaches to delivering green infrastructure. And as I say, I think it's full of interesting material. I think it's of great value to smaller cities working up GI ideas. What we did was a semi-structured interview process with 53 practitioners altogether working in green infrastructure in different ways. There were officers from a variety of different disciplines, but related to green infrastructure, some senior officers, heads of service and senior managers in GI-related departments, and some elected representatives who have responsibility for green infrastructure initiatives in their local authorities. And these were all done in cities of less than 500,000 population, but many of the cities we visited were quite a lot smaller than that. The detail of what we actually did in the interviews is in the report, but essentially we were looking at what cities' priorities were when implementing GI. What were they expecting GI to achieve for them? The kind of obstacles that cities experience in delivering green infrastructure, the things that hinder that approach. And we also sought some feedback on the tools that are available to help cities assess the value of green infrastructure. So this is the results of the priorities assessment. And these are averages, and each city will have its own different set of results for this, but essentially the pattern is quite common among the cities that we visited. Anything over 1, which is the red line across the chart here, means it can be seen as a high priority for the city. Around the 1 mark means it's of some importance, but not necessarily a priority. And anything below the red line means it's not really a priority across these 53 respondents. And this chart tells us 3 things. First of all, it says what local authorities really want from green infrastructure. Secondly, what GI projects therefore need to be offering, and that offer might have to be something alongside the main purpose of the GI project. And thirdly, where these priorities might become a problem in getting an idea through the approval process. And you can see that the highest priority, and it's a high priority by some distance, is an attractive place to live. And 32 of my 53 respondents said this was a high priority in their city. This is not their own view, this is their view of how their city prioritizes things. So above everything else, cities here are looking for making the place look nicer, making the place more attractive. Which is not really one of the main priorities probably behind most green infrastructure projects. In second place comes public health. Now, this research was undertaken before the pandemic, so that might well have changed its position since then. And then below public health come two ecosystem services that you could say contribute to public health in terms of active travel and opportunities for recreation. But it's interesting that other ecosystem services such as pollution, heat, noise are much further down in this table. And so I suggest that the link between those ecosystem services and public health is not as clear as it could be. Resilience also emerges as a high priority in smaller cities GI, but that's mainly focused on surface water flooding. And resilience tends to get a higher priority in cities that would experience problems of extreme weather. Now, biodiversity came out very strongly in that poll that Tako did at the beginning of this webinar. Here it only gets a mid-table ranking. It's of some importance, but it's not necessarily the highest priority for the city. That varies quite a bit between one city and another. In some cities, biodiversity is much more important than this. In others, it's much less. And carbon capture, a key plank of climate change adaptation, is a low priority. It actually comes below that red line. So projects focused on carbon capture already face an uphill challenge. They don't address things that the council thinks are important, even if the council's made a commitment to carbon reduction. And that suggests that projects in low priority areas need to be dressed up in different clothes. The multifunctionality of green infrastructure helps here because most GI projects do more than one thing, even if they have a primary focus. So that focus can be attached to things that are higher priorities. Letting an area grow wild might be good for biodiversity, but might fail as making the place look attractive, unless it was accompanied by ideas such as wildflowers or birdsong, other things that emphasize things that people like to see. Here's the obstacles ranking. And again, anything significantly over that red line can be seen as a serious obstacle. Around the red line means it's an obstacle that can be overcome. And below the red line means not really much of an obstacle at all. And the biggest challenge isn't funding. That comes second, although it's a big challenge in many cities. But the biggest challenge here is conflicting priorities. And those are usually with either housing or highways, big budget services with high level service targets to meet and high level objectives. Green isn't necessarily seen as helpful to housing or highways. It reduces the space available for housing, for instance. And conflicting priorities within the local authority is also echoed further down the list. Partnership with other departments is the fourth from bottom. Partnership with other organizations is the lowest obstacle of all. So it's actually easier for local authority practitioners to partner with outside bodies than it is with inside departments. Well, funding is there as a big issue, but so too is convincing developers, whose main focus is maximizing profit, of course, and proving the value of green infrastructure, convincing the authorities decision makers that green is worth doing, not least because of the revenue costs associated with it. And in the middle of this ranking comes council capacity. Some councils are reasonably well resourced, others are clearly not. And this mid-ranking here is an average of extremes. There are some councils that really struggle with capacity issues, others that are okay in this area. And awareness of GI is also a challenge that councils have to overcome. Awareness can even include opposition, and some of our member authorities here included climate change deniers. But the public seem to be on side. Public skepticism, not a problem. And that's increasingly the case as social media amplifies celebrity voices such as David Attenborough, Greta Thunberg, and even more radical groups such as Extinction Rebellion. Well, funding, as I say, is a problem. And Nature Smart Cities commissioned a review by a specialist financial consultant, Simon Mills, of the options and opportunities for financing green infrastructure projects, including more innovative approaches than simply looking for grants and subsidies. Simon discusses in this report, which is also available on our website, some quite sophisticated financial mechanisms like green bonds and loans, policy performance bonds, and private sector ownership of public spaces, but also more familiar ideas such as crowdfunding and philanthropy. And we explored some of this in our interviews as part of the examination of funding. Virtually no one was using any of these mechanisms other than philanthropy. And even that came with its own problems, because some of the companies that want to use philanthropy are trying to burnish a green reputation that may have become damaged by their practice. So there were concerns about greenwashing. So philanthropy is a potential source of funding for GI, but it's associated with reputational damage, and that may be too high a price for you to pay. Well, the results are interesting in themselves, and they're explored more fully in our report. But there's a bigger picture, I think, that emerges from this work. And the first element of that is evidencing the value of GI. Research elsewhere confirms our finding that it's a significant weakness for smaller authorities, the ability to present a convincing business case. Why should the municipality invest in GI? What will it gain from doing so? In some cases, the shortfall's in financial evidence, proving the value in monetary terms. In others, it's a reliance on anecdotal evidence, which can be intrinsically weak and which is easily challenged by alternative anecdotal evidence from a different point of view. Secondly, comparing green alternatives with grey. Costings for grey are generally seen as more reliable, are usually based on calculations that have been done before and which are made with trusted data. Calculations for green are often more speculative, and some benefits of green defy monetization, even though they're clearly valuable. Biodiversity is a prime example of this. Green already finds it difficult to push its way into major projects, and this weakness is one of the reasons why. And thirdly, the issues of capacity, the shortages of time, skills, and resources. It's only a mid-ranking problem in our analysis, but actually it's something that lies behind several other issues. Conflicting priorities, because green can't get a seat at the table or make its case sufficiently powerfully. Funding, because authorities lack the skills to make the bids or to manage them when they're successful in winning. And also because they don't have the funding to spend up front for those financial packages that pay retrospectively. Capacity, because green advocates don't have the arguments or the assessment capabilities to argue with developers and planners over proposals. Capacity, because green officers don't have the time to increase others' awareness of green's value and its cost effectiveness. And I think at this point, Tako is going to ask us some questions about this.
Could Lynn please launch the poll? There we are. Yes. So Phil, would you like to introduce the questions, or shall I do it?
No, that's fine. So first of all, the first question is, do these three bigger picture challenges ring true for you? Are they a big problem, often a problem, sometimes a problem, or not really a problem for you? The second question is, do you identify with these challenges in your authority? I think that's actually the same question. One is first of all, for evidencing the value of nature. Secondly, for comparing green alternatives with grey. And thirdly, this issue of capacity. Are you short of time, skills, and resources? And is that often a problem for you? Let's have your answers to these.
%50 voted.
Okay, well, I think we have 50% of our audience is from local authorities, so perhaps that's as much as we're going to get. Let's have a look at the results, Lee. Okay, so 56% of you say that evidencing the value of nature is often a problem, and almost everyone else says it's sometimes a problem. There's going to be a queue outside the office of the 3% who say it's not a problem to find out what your solution is. Comparing green alternatives with grey, again, 50% say it's often a problem, and almost everybody else says it's sometimes a problem. And on capacity, yeah, 58%. So nearly 3 in 5 of you say it's often a problem. And most of the rest, again, say it's sometimes a problem. So it seems as if these issues are not just something I've dreamt up. These are actually real issues in the real world for most local authorities, and particularly perhaps the smaller ones. So green teams need help. And that's where tools come in. There are lots of them out there. They're offering different things. They're looking at specific green benefits and so on. But most of them are hidden in academic literature that practitioners don't have time to search, to read. And even the best of these tools can fall at one or more hurdles. Owito has been looking at the tools, and he's going to have more to say about that in the next presentation. But in the meantime, I'm very happy to take any questions that there are about what I've had to say.
So thank you, Phil, for this explanation on the analysis and the research that you did to find out what exactly are the priorities and the challenges of local authorities. To the audience, feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A even now if you want to ask Phil anything. A question that came to my mind, and I think you briefly hinted at this in the beginning already, but in a transnational project like Nature Smart Cities, I would be curious to know, have you found differences in the various countries, for instance, in terms of how cities or elected members prioritize different aspects of green infrastructures, or how they see challenges, or is this very similar?
Yeah, there are differences between countries. One obvious one, for instance, is that the priority that emerges for active travel is very different in the Netherlands than it is in the other 3 countries. And I surmise that that's because the Netherlands has largely solved the issue of active travel, whereas other countries are still working on those challenges. So that's an important difference. And there are other differences. But what I'm struck by is the commonalities between different countries. The kind of issues that come up in one country relating to conflicting priorities, they're echoed right across the spectrum here. There are cities in in each of our 4 countries where green has difficulty in being heard and in getting a seat at the table. It's largely marginalized to the edges of larger projects, and even in cities that have commitments to net zero or to climate change adaptation, those commitments are still very much in the abstract. They're not being translated yet into formal policy on the ground, not very often.
Right, and could you conclude that there are at least 2 levels of where a move needs to be made in these local authorities? On the one hand, in terms of, let's say, the organizational and the practical aspects of funding, of getting the skills and the staff and the resources. And the other is much more an awareness issue, where there might be insufficient knowledge of how green infrastructures can capture carbon, can benefit pollution reduction, etc. How do you see this on the basis of this research?
Well, both of those are true. Green practitioners need a lot more help in making their case and in making a more convincing case for green infrastructure that decision makers in their authorities will find it more difficult to put to one side. I think, though, also local authorities need to take a more corporate approach to green issues. They need to own the green agenda much more than they do at the moment, and they need to set corporate priorities and then look to green solutions to address those priorities. At the moment, many decision makers, and this is particularly true of politicians, work on a short-term basis. They look to the next electoral cycle. So they want projects that can be completed and perhaps provide photo opportunities within that electoral cycle. The issues of climate change and adaptation are much more long-term issues. They're not going to be addressed in a 4 or 5 year electoral cycle. And we need to develop the understanding that these are important issues that are more important than short-term solutions. The other challenge is to make these long-term changes into short-term phases that will actually meet the needs of politicians who think that way. But we need a complete cultural change, really, on these issues to say, well, this is important. It's something we can only address in the long term. So let's do some long-term work.
Right, and start today.
Yeah.
And of course,
or
yesterday, yeah. Can't turn back the clock, unfortunately. We could also argue that the photo opportunities for politicians in a green surrounding are much more aesthetic and attractive, of course, than when they're posing next to a new highway.
Yes, or a concrete drainage project. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. Thanks very much, Phil, for this insight in the movers and the blockers of investing